Hi, this is Matthew Baldwin of Mars Hill University, and this is Religion 201, the Bible as Literature. Welcome to lecture number 3, which, as the syllabus explains, I've given a title, Theoretical Lecture, Common versus Academic Reading of the Bible. In other words, I'm going to talk today a little bit about the theory of biblical studies, the underlying ideas that differentiate what we do in academic reading of the Bible from the way that many people approach the Bible in their daily lives or in their religious experience. And I'm not trying to draw a distinction between these two ways of approaching the Bible in order to say that one is better than the other. What I am doing, however, is pointing out that you're in an academic course on the Bible in college and at the university level. And so I'm going to help to try to prepare you for understanding the difference between the way that you're going to be taught to read the Bible in this course versus the way that your prior experience with the Bible may have led you to think about it and read it. It's not to say that you should never go back to that other way. Once you've been exposed to this, it changes you forever. This is an enriching tool, but it's also an exposure to a long tradition of scholarly approaches to the Bible that is connected to the learned tradition of the church, the Christian church, as well as the synagogue tradition of Judaism and the rabbis. But it's also connected to over 200 years of secular scholarship in universities in the West. And so there are thousands and thousands of practitioners, people who hold PhDs, who read the Bible in ways that are similar to what you're going to be learning in this course. And I want you to try to understand better how their reading is different from what you might be used to. So as we begin to think about this, we're going to start by differentiating between popular versus academic reading of the Bible. And you're going to notice that as I talk about what I'm calling popular reading of the Bible, there's an area of it, a category of it that shades over into the academic reading of the Bible. And this reflects the tradition and the history that stands behind these practices. So when we talk about popular readings of the Bible, I think that there are really 3 types that we need to think about. There's a type that I'm going to call the oracular reading, the type that I'm going to call the devotional reading, and the type that I'm going to call the theological reading. So that's oracular, devotional, and theological. Now, oracular reading has the least support among anyone who gives too much thought to it or enough thought to it. Oracular reading, although it is practiced frequently and people do it more often than you suppose, it doesn't really have much in the way to recommend it. And it is tied to what many people would identify as superstition or other forms of practices of magic and things like that. Basically, the oracular reading treats the Bible. I have one here just for illustrative purposes. This book, oftentimes in a black leatherette binding, it treats the Bible as a kind of black box, a magic black box. And it contains instant feedback from God to a believer answering questions. So I could, for instance, in an oracular mode, I could ask a question like, how's the fishing going to be today if I go down and fish at Lake Julian? And I'll just flip somewhere in the Bible and press my finger against it, and it says, gather up your bundle from the ground, O you who live under siege. For thus says the Lord, I am going to sling out the inhabitants of the land at this time, and I will bring distress on them so that they shall feel it. And the oracular reader might say, that sounds like the fishing's going to be good. I'm going to get a whole bundle of fish. They're going to be on the ground, and the Lord is going to be with me as I sling out the inhabitants of the land, which in this case means obviously Lake Julian. This kind of oracular reading of the Bible maybe seems silly to you, but there are people who practice it as a treatment of the book as a kind of source book for giving answers to your questions. And you just ask them and you have random, you don't use any kind of system or method. You just trust. It's based on pure faith that when you open the pages of this, the answers to the questions on your heart are present. There are many fine, very scholarly people in the past who have report experiences like this, where they've received answers to questions they had just by merely opening the magic black book. But the negatives of this approach is that it lacks any kind of rule of interpretation or process for determining truth. Not only that, is that you could easily end up causing harm by taking your own interpretation of a random verse as the message from the divine being. You could see that there's a lot of material in this book that could end up causing harm if you read it this way. And the further negative of it is that it's easily falsified. I could go fishing and not have the experience that the book promises, or I could have it, and it's simply easily mocked and rejected by anyone who is willing to apply a little bit of more systematic study to the text. So that's the oracular. I'm going to just say that we don't need to mount much of an argument against it. I think it's easy to see its shortcomings. A much more common way of reading the Bible takes place in people's living rooms and in church study groups and in private areas and in cafes, and you see it all the time, and there's nothing wrong with it. I call it the devotional reading of the Bible. I make my living on the fact that people love the Bible and value it. But devotional reading can be characterized in the following ways, and I think we've seen some of it in the examples that I brought forth in the first two lectures. Devotional reading is centered on the self, and it sees the text as containing meanings which are relative and relational to the self. So you could call it, and I don't mean this in a strictly negative sense, you could call devotional reading egocentric reading. It treats the Bible as communication directed at the self or the ego. It also tends to treat the text as an undifferentiated whole. In that sense, it's like the oracular reading. The book is a whole, and wherever you go in it, you find that the devotional reader is working with the assumption that there's a single purpose to the text, which is to communicate meaning to the self. And so the single purpose assumption is that it informs the person who reads the text of God's will for that person. That it's very individual, it's directed towards you as a person. And it assumes that the text is internally unified, that it contains a point of view and message that is unified throughout its extent. And because it assumes that there is unity to the text, paradoxically, it doesn't investigate very far into the text often. Paradoxically, although it emphasizes this wholeness of the text, the reading of devotional readers tend to isolate passages from the whole and treat them without reference to their larger context. Again, paradoxically, the devotional reading emphasizes the truth of the text, but it's always ready to explain away what it reads in the text as meaning something for the self other than what the text explicitly says. And we call this method of taking the literal meaning of the text and then suggesting that it actually means something else, allegory. And allegory or allegorical reading comes from roots in the Greek that mean other than what is open, what is in the open. So what is in the open, the actual meaning is other than that. Allos agora. The allegorical reading works with the assumptions that the text says truth, but because the text is assumed to be true and to have meaning for the self, whenever there's a tension between what is found in the text and what the self thinks it might be saying to it, it simply steps into allegory and ignores the literal meaning of the text. The positives of this allegorical reading, of this devotional reading, including its allegorical work, is that there's a respect for this text. This text is held in high regard. It's held as sacred, it's held as profound and meaningful. All of those are positive qualities for the reader to approach the text with. And also, devotional reading of the text can positively be stated to involve an engagement or an interest in the text, which is valuable in itself and not to be disregarded in its value. So again, this respect and engagement and interest that is shown for the text, that is a part of devotional reading, all is to be lauded. And also, I would say that there's nothing wrong with having a self or an ego and having needs for the ego to know things and to believe things and to experience things as being meaningful or to know truth, right? The existential concerns of ourselves, our own existential concerns as readers are important. We're all looking for meaning. We're all looking for truth. And we're all looking to understand human being and our relationship to the divine. And those things, those values, and those practices that inform devotional reading are all powerful and important parts of who we are as readers. And even academic readers have those existential points of connection to this text, and they shouldn't be denied. The negatives of the devotional reading, though, are substantial. And the main negative is that the practice of devotional reading is not necessarily disciplined or consistent in its approach to the text, or when to decide when something is allegorized or not allegorized. This inconsistency and lack of discipline in devotional reading tends to reinforce the desires of the ego, so that the devotional reader might fall into the trap of seeing only what they want to see, or to gloss over difficulties that the text presents them, and to explain away tensions between the text and their own position, to explain them away and to develop idiosyncratic or egocentric meanings that are actually at odds oftentimes with what the text is actually saying from an academic point of view. There's a kind of tunnel vision that sets in with the devotional reader, where the reader tends to miss the bigger picture and not challenge their own assumptions or their background knowledge. And so they don't necessarily grow in knowledge, but rather they bring the knowledge that they already have to the text, and they find it confirmed there. And that's, I think, the problem of devotional reading when it lacks that discipline and consistency. And what do I mean by things like discipline? Well, just think about this. How many people who are devotionally reading the Bible are also systematically studying historical knowledge or linguistic, or what we call philological knowledge, like knowledge of underlying language. When you start to add in those kinds of attention, you move from the devotional to the next stage of what I've termed the popular reading, or the reading of the people of the Bible, which is the theological reading. It's the third type of popular, and it's the closest of the three to what I'm terming academic reading. And in fact, it's in many ways the mother of academic reading. The theology is sometimes called the queen of the disciplines. And in the history of the Western Academy, the development of the university system is tied hand in hand with the rise of systematic and disciplined theology among Christians. Historically speaking, the rise of theological work is tied with the rise of science. And in fact, they referred to the theological sciences. Science is a way of knowing things. And so theology, or theological readings of the Bible, overcomes many of the negatives of the devotional by approaching the text with discipline and in a community that is much more scholarly in its orientation. It treats the text as representing the speech of God, and this it shares in common with the devotional and the oracular reading. And what it does is it treats that text as establishing doctrine. And so theological readings tend to emphasize the ways that the text relates to the doctrine of community. and the doctrine of traditions, and the doctrine that grounds practices of communities. So in other words, it's a very religious, it's oriented towards religion and the practice of religion and the teachings of religion and the discipline of religious order. The theological reading tends to regard the text as having a very high authority and commanding obedience within the kind of doctrinal structure that is developed by reading the text in this theological way. And so the text is treated as always framing answers that are theological. In other words, answers about God. If you have questions about God, you go to the theological reader, and the theological reader answers those questions about God in a doctrinally authoritative way by reading from the text. So the positives of the theological tradition are that it follows rules of interpretation, and it transcends the individual ego. The ambivalent aspects of the theological tradition of reading are that it gives the text often unquestioned authority, and that authority exists within particular communities, and outside those communities that authority is questioned, but within the community it is unquestioned, or it can't be questioned. And the trouble with that is that there are all these different competing communities of theological interpretation. What the community or what the Bible says within a particular tradition or structure, theological structure, what is said to say and what it is said to command depends on the interpreter and on the community of the interpreter. So that the Quaker and the Baptist and the Presbyterian all give slightly different answers from the Methodist and the Lutheran and the Episcopalian, who all give slightly different answers from the Catholic and the Orthodox, and so on, right? The Ethiopic. And all of those, which are in the broad umbrella of Christian traditions and theology, give very different answers in terms of how they frame, how they see the text as communicating doctrine and authoritative statements about God. They give very different answers from, say, the Jewish. And the Jewish reading gives answers that are itself different and at odds with the answers that were once found there by ancient Israelite readers of the text. And so I hope that what we're going to see as we study together is we're very much interested in these communities of theological reading, but we find that there's an ambivalence there in the diversity of communities and the approaches that they give to interpreting the text. How do you know which tradition and which theology is the right one or has the right answer in spite of its discipline and its respect for the authority of the text? It's difficult to say sometimes which theological reading is the right one. And how do you know what are the boundaries of the community over which the text has authority to speak? And that last element brings up one of what I would consider to be a negative potential, at least, for theological approaches to the reading of the text, and explains why academic reading began to rise out of the theological. And this negative is that the disciplined reading of Scripture reveals internal diversity within the Scripture. Theological readings that are sophisticated recognize this. There's internal diversity, which raises questions which traditions have to answer in different ways. So theological reading, like devotional reading, tends to obscure this internal diversity of necessity in order to allow this text to speak with one authoritative voice. In other words, theological reading tends to decide which part of the text have more authority than others. And this isn't based necessarily on logic or reason or even experience or historical principles, but it's based on tradition and community needs. And you could see this certainly if, for example, you were to compare the ways that a Baptist and a Jew read the book of Leviticus. And so or read the book even of Genesis within the theological traditions of their religious background. They're going to come up with different understandings of how the text authority applies to them. And so that boundaries of the community that is spoken to by the interpreter's understanding of the text are difficult to define, and it often results in inter-community conflict. It can lead to political conflict as well, as I'm sure you're aware, looking out at the history of America, as people bring the authority of the Bible to bear on political questions and questions of social order. Their assumption is that the text is speaking theologically and doctrinally, and that it must be obeyed. It has absolute authority of humans outside of all boundaries of community. And that's a potential political liability, especially in a society that values open inquiry and freedom of thought and a separation of religious and state structures. And that brings us to the next category, which is differentiated from the popular, and that's academic reading and the type of reading that I'm going to present to you. Academic reading doesn't necessarily exclude popular reading, but in some cases, academic reading takes popular reading of the Bible as its data field. We're interested in the history of reading of the Bible. We're interested in contemporary readers of the Bible, but we're also, even more so, as an academy. And when I say the Academy of Academic Readers of the Bible, I'm talking about institutional structures like the Society of Biblical Literature, an 8,000 member body of scholarly readers of the Bible. We have in common things like philological training in the underlying languages of biblical texts, and historical training to work as historians, and also training with historical knowledge as background for reading the texts. And we work together across many disciplines and traditions in terms of our religious backgrounds, and we don't require particular kinds of religious commitments in order to do the work. So how does all this work? Well, one of the key elements of biblical scholarship or academic reading of the Bible is that it's very much centered on the text itself. It's not centered on the self, although you never can escape the self as a reader of the Bible. Your ego is there, but it's centered on the text. It puts the focus on the text. And it doesn't focus or center on the text as containing meanings for the self, the way devotional reading does. Rather, it centers on the text as containing meanings for those who originally produced it. And they had an intent in producing that text to communicate those meanings and stabilize them. And they wanted to intervene in their own original communities. So the text also contained meanings for those who originally read it, who were in the original audience. And it had an impact and an influence on that original audience. And of course, the audience of the text extends from whenever it was composed all the way down to our own present time. So there are many different layers of the idea of the audience of the text. But the interest of the academic reading is, once again, on the text, and as the text as containing meanings for its original author and audience and other audiences after. So we're interested in that layer of meaning, not in immediately applying the meanings of the text to ourselves. The academic reading of the text of the Bible brackets the question of the text's authority. And you think about the way a scholar of Shakespeare reads Shakespeare, right? Shakespeare has authority to be Shakespeare, and the Bible has the authority to be itself, the Bible. But the Shakespeare scholar doesn't necessarily approach the text of Shakespeare as having any kind of community or personal authority over them. The only authority that it has is to be itself. You can't put forward the works of John Keats and say, this is Shakespeare, right? That's Keats and that's Shakespeare. And in the same way, biblical texts are themselves. And we bracket the question of a religious or social or political or community or theological or doctrinal authority that the text may have for particular communities of readers, and instead look at what is the text trying to do. Often it is important to bear in mind that when our focus is on this authorship and original audience, and the authors and original audiences were not part of our contemporary communities. And so their intentions and their meanings were not even directed at our contemporary communities. They certainly weren't directed at our own egos. And so we understand the notion of the authority of the text very differently. The authority of the text is to be itself, to be what it is, to have had its particular history. And that is to be respected. But we bracket the question of its authority over us. It has authority for members of various traditions, but it can be read for itself. And that is what academic readers do. We try to understand the text on its own terms. So we treat the text as a product of human activity, as a product of historical processes. And we treat the text as a collection of different writings. Unlike the popular reading, which tends to assume the sort of unity of the text, academic readers have come to understand the Bible as being internally diverse, differentiated within itself. It is not necessarily unified in its point of view or message. It's a library of writings that were composed for a period of time that is well over 1,000 years in length by dozens, literally dozens of different human beings who were involved in the authorship of it and who were undergoing different historical contexts and experiences. And so we don't look at the text, reading it to try to understand a single message of it, but rather we look at the texts, plural texts of the Bible, and we study them in order to produce knowledge about the human past, about human culture, about religion and religions, and to theorize and better understand who we are as people. And so, although academic reading doesn't assume the unity of the text, it does recognize broad patterns and structures that are at work across many texts. And these can be recognized and investigated, and they can provide evidence for our theorizing. And so, although we don't, one of the paradoxes of academic reading is that although we don't assume the unity of the text, our readings embrace more of the text, and we treat it more holistically. By emphasizing contents and structures, we don't just dive in and find a couple verses of a book like Jeremiah. We look at the whole book of Jeremiah and we try to see how it's arranged, and we try to see what it contains and what it was doing in its time and its place. We don't take verses and passages out of context, asking what they mean. We look for the significance of everything in the text for developing an understanding of the text as a whole. So I have one of my sayings and my rules of interpretation is, everything in the text is significant. And this is the password. Here is the password for the quiz. Everything in the text is significant. That's all lowercase. Every word is separate. And here's the phrase again. The password or the passphrase is, everything in the text is significant. Because academics don't assume that the text necessarily has a true meaning for us, we don't need ever to read away or allegorize things we find in the text. If there's a conflict between our own worldview and beliefs and what we find in the text, we just let that stand. When humans approach fiction, we do this all the time. We call reading, we talk about the willing suspension of disbelief, right? When you're reading a fantastic book or watching a fantastic movie, you get into the story even though you know it's all just a fantasy, and we talk about the willing suspension of disbelief. In the same way, The academic reader of the Bible doesn't need to engage in allegorical explaining away of passages that seem puzzling or to conflict with other established beliefs that we may have. When we encounter internal diversity within the text, we let the text stand. We take this text at its word. We practice literary reading, which means we practice literal reading. And here's another phrase. I want to emphasize this. This will be in one of the multiple choices on the quiz regarding this little lecture. The point of, one of the points of academic reading of the Bible is to teach you literary reading. And what is literary reading? What is literary reading of the Bible? Literary reading is literal reading. All good reading starts with literal reading, reading the text literally to see what it actually says and taking it at its word based on the words that are found in the text. Now, one of the things that distinguishes academic readers of the Bible from many popular readers of the Bible is the knowledge of the underlying language, which allows us to go even deeper into the question of what are the literal words in the text saying. And sometimes you can take that too far, and other times, by paying close attention to the literal words of the text, you get deep, deep into what the text is actually saying. It has to be done with attention to the original language and to the fact that oftentimes we're just reading in translation. So the positives of this method, academic reading of the Bible, are that the payoff is ultimately much greater joy and understanding when reading. They come alive in their fullness, and the yield of reading as academics is greater understanding of the human past and the ways that the structures and ideologies, belief systems and doctrines that people are promoting in these texts, these past ideas are still present in our own time and in the cultures that we inhabit. There are negatives to the academic reading of the Bible, but like many people who promote a particular frame of reference, like I do, academic reading of the Bible, I'm going to frame the negatives in a covertly positive way. The negatives of reading the Bible academically are that it is like other sciences, it's hard work. It takes hard work reading with discipline, and it requires seeing through the surface with a critical eye. It often requires that we bracket our own faith or that we suspend disbelief, and all of those things are hard. So learning the techniques and the tools is hard. Paying sustained attention to a text is hard. Letting a text speak for itself is hard. Seeing through surfaces to structures and pasts and sources and other things like that is hard work. It's critical work. And scientific practice doesn't come naturally. You don't sit under a tree, have an apple hit you on the head, and come up with the formula that describes gravity. Scientific work takes discipline, investigation, and work, and it just isn't a natural process. And the same goes for academic reading of the Bible. You actually have to learn to do it. You have to train over a long period of years. And so this course can be an introduction to it and a taste of it. It's certainly not the end point of actual academic reading of the Bible. We're just trying to familiarize you with it. And one of the negatives is how hard the work can be. And of course, like science, sometimes this kind of work can be accused of being cold or dull. But it is neither of those things for those whose souls are burning for knowledge and understanding. So this course then is, in this course, you're going to learn about and practice academic reading of the Bible. It's not to say that one should never do devotional reading. One certainly can and should, I think, have a spiritual life and read with devotion at times. The scientist is not always doing science. But here you are in a college course, and in this course, You get a glimpse of the way that scholars read the Bible, the way that historians and scholars of literature and theorists of human culture and religion read a book that two great religious traditions in the world regard as the most sacred and powerful text in all the world. So in conclusion, I want to say a few words about how academics would answer the question, what is the Bible? And how that shapes our reading. First of all, today's academics would reject the idea that the Bible is a book. The word Bible comes from the word biblia, which is Greek plural, meaning books, and has long been acknowledged by readers in both the theological and the academic tradition that the Bible is actually a collection of books. So it's a collection of books. That's the first answer. Now, unlike the theological reading of the Bible, the academic reading does not start with the assumption that these books have God as their author. Academics recognize and work with the very real and open in the Bible fact of human authorship of the texts. The Bible does not try to conceal the fact that humans are the author of the text, or that humans are stand behind the voices that are present in biblical texts. But sometimes we forget that in our devotional reading, theological readings, and see only God's voice behind these texts. But academics approach and answer that question, what is the Bible, by saying it is a collection of human texts. Furthermore, academics are very much united in recognizing that this is an ancient book or set of books. It's a collection of ancient texts, and they were not written in our own language. They've been translated into every language in the world, and they've been multiply translated in many different times and places into our own language, so that there are many different competing English translations, for example, of the Bible. Many different competing English translations. What are they translating? Well, they're translating these ancient books that were written in ancient languages, in ancient Hebrew, in ancient Aramaic, and in ancient Greek. Primarily, the Bible consists of two halves. We call them, in the Protestant tradition, the Old Testament and the New Testament. In the academic tradition, they are referred to usually as the Hebrew scriptures and the early Christian writings. The Hebrew scriptures were, as the name suggests, largely written in Hebrew, and the early Christian writings were written in Greek for historical reasons, which I hope will become clear in the course of this course. A few of the so-called Hebrew scriptures appear with passages or whole sections in Aramaic, which is an earlier language than Hebrew, or a coeval language with Hebrew, but which became a language used by Jews at a particular point in the history of the Israelite peoples. What else? Well, we recognize that the Bible is, as a collection of human texts, a sacred and authoritative set of scriptures for three major religious traditions. The ancient Israelite tradition, which gave birth to the Jewish tradition, which is ancient and also persists to this day, and that these same texts became authoritative for the Christian tradition, which is also obviously still with us today. We recognize that these books record the ideas and aspirations and experiences of particular people at particular times and places. And we want to emphasize this, and we can't emphasize this enough, that the people and the times and places whose experiences and ideas are reflected in the biblical texts are not necessarily the people who are being described in the text. Now, it's hard to kind of wrap your mind around this for a second, so we maybe take an analogy from literary studies. If you read a book like, I don't know, Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, you know that the author is a man named Samuel Clemens, and he takes a pen name called Mark Twain, and he wrote a book. And when we read the book, it's about a fictional character named Huckleberry Finn. And Mark Twain is not Huckleberry Finn. And the voice that speaks in the book is a narrator, and that narrator isn't Mark Twain, it's Huckleberry Finn. And so, although Huckleberry Finn lives in a world that's very similar in time and place to Mark Twain, it's not the same world. There's a world of the narrator and the narrative, and then there's the world of the author, and those two things are separate. Especially because books in the Bible are often sort of historical in cast. You have later writers telling stories about earlier characters. And there's a disconnect and a difference between the worlds of the author and the world of the narrator. And then there's an obvious difference between the world of the author and the world of the audience. They're two different worlds in many cases, just as your world as a reader of the text is very different from the world of the ancient readers of the text. Even the ancient readers of the text are separated in time and place oftentimes from the world of the authors of the text. And this becomes more complicated sometimes because sometimes authors draw on sources, and sources were written even earlier than the author, and then the author makes those sources his own or her own. And so there are these competing worlds, and this is a really important point, which will be in the quiz. The point is that there are three worlds to consider when we're reading. There are three worlds to consider when reading any book, but when reading the Bible, there are three worlds to consider: the world of the author, the world of the narrative, and the world of the readers. So when I say that we would answer the question, what is the Bible, by saying it is a record of the ideas and aspirations and experiences of particular people in particular times and places, I'm largely talking about the world of the authors. When a historian writes a history, they're writing about the past, and they're telling a story about the past, and to a certain extent, they are giving us information about that past that they're writing about. And so you can sometimes use a history to just as a transparent window into another world. But you can also use a history as a window into the world of the author of the history. You ask questions like, why has the author presented the history that the author is presenting in the way that the author is presenting it? It's a complex idea. But when I say that the Bible records the ideas and aspirations and experiences of particular people, I'm talking about the world of the authors. So as we begin, for example, to read the book of Genesis, as we begin our first unit in this course on the primeval narrative, we begin to read the story of creation itself. As we begin to read this text, I want you to ask yourself, whose voice is speaking in verse 1:1? Whose voice? Now that voice is the voice of a narrator, and there's an author that stands behind the narrative voice that's produced in the text. Who is that author? What is their world? Why are they telling us the story that they're telling us? How are they telling us the story that they're telling us? And how does the story that they tell us reflect their ideas and aspirations and experiences of human life and of the world that they live in? The world of the narrative is separate from the world of the author. Just as you can imagine, to reach for an example from another culture, the world of the narrative stands on its own. In the movie Star Wars, it begins by saying, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And then it tells you a story. That world, that galaxy far, far away, a long time ago, it's an imaginary world, but it's a complete world, and it's expansive, and it's been expanded and augmented by the imagination of many different filmmakers, writers, artists, and other things. But it's an imaginary world that is differentiated from the world of the authors. You can ask, when you watch Star Wars, the original film, how it reflects the historical experiences, ideas, and aspirations of its original author, George Lucas. But if you watch The Mandalorian, which participates in the same narrative world, you can ask about the ideas and aspirations of Jon Favreau, who is more of a contemporary of ours. There's a 40-year span, almost, or more than a 40-year span of time between the author's world of The Mandalorian and the author's world of Star Wars. So we approach the Bible, we answer the question by saying, it's this ancient collection of writings in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, sacred scriptures, recording ideas and aspirations of particular peoples at particular times. We recognize there's this disconnect between the world that is shaped by the narrative and the world of the authors and the world of the readers, the worlds of the readers, since the readers come from different worlds through history. We also say, ultimately, the Bible is a text, it contains many texts. And what is a text? A text is a set of particular words on a page. It consists of those words and no others. So we say it is a text, and as a text, it shares with many other texts the communicative purposes of human texts. Humans produce texts all the time. They produce texts for fun. They produce texts for entertainment. They produce texts to change the world. They produce texts to report, but they report on things to serve human interests. And so we are looking at it as a text, as a particular set of words, and we assume, like with any text, that it represents human interests. To begin to read a text, you have to know what the text says. To do any kind of reading, you have to begin with literary reading. You have to begin with literal reading in order to get to the literary reading, to allow the world of the narrative or the world of the text to emerge, to understand and see through that to the world of the author, and to learn more about how the world of the audience has been shaped by the text and went on to shape the worlds of authors who produced more texts in this collection of texts through time. Finally, I just want to say once again, I'm reiterating a point I made earlier, that the academic reader of the Bible intends first and foremost to let the text speak for itself. We don't impose our view on the text. We let the world of the narrative form. If the story tells us the story of creation, we let that story unfold in its own way, and we see it for what it is. We don't try to force the world of the narrative into the world of the reader. But rather, we try to see the world of the narrative for what it is and see through it into the world of the author. So that concludes my theoretical lecture number 3. Please go and take the lecture number 3 quiz, and I'll see you in class soon.